Hi, this is Who Gets to Play with the Robot, examining CS Education tangibles and accessibility. I'm Dr. Caroline Harden, and this work was done in collaboration with Parama Chaudhry and Yasmin Oglali. Computer science education robots and tangibles, which are designed for classroom use for people to learn computer science concepts, are fun, effective, and increasingly popular. But are they actually designed for all students in mind, or are some students being left out of the fun? In the literature review, we've seen that there has been some surveys of CS educational robots, but even since these were done just a few years ago, the number of devices available has tripled. Some papers have analyzed specific robots for accessibility, but they haven't looked at the larger landscape of what materials are available for teachers and educators when they're trying to pick a particular robot. The design guidelines from a few researchers have been helpful, particularly Kubelet et al. From 2021, but again, it hasn't been applied to the field in breadth. So our research question was, does the manufacturer's website provide information about the device's accessibility? We picked this research question on the premise that if a device was designed for accessibility, then surely they would use that in the specification or the marketing materials or in the teacher-provided materials. Then, to indicate whether or not this is actually a problem, maybe the devices are all largely accessible, we analyzed a sample 3 robots to see if they could be used by students who are blind, colorblind, deaf, or hard of hearing, and if these devices need other supportive tools. For our methods, to answer research question 1, we used the wget tool to retrieve all manufacturer web pages. We searched for as many robots as we could find and compiled a list of about 90, and from those that had manufacturer websites, we started with those. Some devices only had information on the resellers' websites, and we didn't want to rely on the resellers' websites because that information may not be as complete or accurate. We also grabbed all web pages linked to it, since perhaps the information for teachers is linked to from the main sales page. We took all those pages and we ran them through the grep tool, looking for the words accessibility, accessible, disability, blind, and deaf. And all hits were hand checked to understand the context in which these words were used. To understand if this is indeed a potential serious problem, we picked 3 robots that are popular on the market and represent a breadth of form factors and interactivity. And these were analyzed by 2 researchers using an accessibility framework to show whether or not this could indicate problems. The framework we use looks at a number of aspects, such as how can students interact with it, are the interactions and feedback multiple modalities, do they rely on only colors or sounds, how much dexterity is needed to use these, and so on. Our results, we ended up looking at 83 websites. Except for a few exceptions, the word accessibility was only used to refer to the website itself. The devices never talked about the accessibility of their devices or provided any information about how accessible or not they were. The word accessible was used as a synonym for fun or easy to understand. Quoting one website, they said their device makes topics like engineering and computer science engaging, accessible, and relevant for all learners. But their all learners didn't seem to include students with disabilities, as they provided no information on how their device may or may not actually be accessible. The few exceptions, Cubeto in a blog post discussed how their device had been used at a school for the deaf, and Unreleased Splats had an article about how they were used at a school for the blind, but not a lot of other resources were provided for teachers who might want to replicate those situations. CodeJumper was a refreshing exception which was specifically designed for blind and visually impaired students, and Robots Lab actually had a whole page dedicated to how their robots could be used by special education teachers. So how much of a problem are there with the devices? Just because the websites don't have information, maybe there is no problem. So we looked at 3. The first one we looked at was Osmo, which uses small tiles which are read by the camera on an iPad and interacts with an app. This could be used by students who are deaf or hard of hearing, but not for students who have visual visually impaired because the app requires you to be able to see and touch things, and there was no raised profiles on the tiles. You couldn't have interacted with them. The Bee-Bot is a small robot that moves around controlled by buttons. This could be used by students with visual disabilities or who are deaf or hard of hearing, as all the buttons had raised profiles, multiple modalities, including voice, lights, and movement, and was remarkably accessible. Ozobot was the third robot we looked at. This was a small robot that can either follow colored lines and using the pattern of the colors to program it, or it could be controlled with an app. This could be used by students who are deaf or hard of hearing, but not by students who are blind or visually impaired or who are colorblind. And the app does not offer very much accessibility either. So this device did not adhere to accessibility guidelines. So as a discussion with research question 1, with a few exceptions, the websites of the CS Education robots and tangibles did not offer any material for educators in terms of how accessible the robots are and what the design constraints were. But looking at the devices, we saw that there was a wide range of whether or not the devices could be used. Some of them could be used, and some of them could be used by some students and not others. So it's a real problem that we don't know very much about this. We hope that this work has drawn attention to this issue, that we need more information about how these CS Education robots and tangibles are or are not accessible, hopefully by the manufacturer's website. And we've demonstrated that these devices can be helpfully analyzed using a framework for accessibility to understand relatively quickly how each device could be used within a classroom. However, more work is needed. In future work, we hope to assess more robots and publish the findings on a website for teachers so they can quickly look up from these now almost 90 devices available which ones may work with their students in their classroom. We also hope to include classroom teachers and children with disabilities in future robot analysis. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email us.